So tonight we're going to cover what causes mud and why we might want to manage our manure. We're going to talk about some short-term solutions for what we can do right now, and then long-term solutions for what we can plan for after this winter. And we'll talk about some things to consider when designing a winter confinement area, how to store, handle, and apply manure, and we'll talk about some things to consider when designing a livestock manure bin. So let's dig right in. So we're gonna talk about mud first and addressing that. So what causes mud on our farm? There are certainly reasons that we already know about, like in our area, we receive 40 to 50 inches of rain, and 75% of that annual rainfall occurs between October and March. So that's pretty difficult to deal with. There are certain things out of our control, like if we have poorly draining soils. And there are some things that are due to the way we might currently manage things. And the best news about that is they may be things we can adjust with our management or how we set up systems. So you might have different, issues of bare soil. Maybe it's from a lot of grazing pressure, or maybe there's ponding in certain areas and grass is growing poorly. In some cases, there might be vegetation that's not as deeply rooted. So, that root structure is really going to create channels for water to drain and hold that soil in place. So that can be an added challenge. And then as manure and bedding break down, they're going to become mud. So, that can be really, really tricky in figuring out how to manage that in those areas in the winter. And then for if you've got shelters or barns right beside where your animals are, if there's water pouring off the roof into that area, that can create a lot more mud. And then soil compaction, which is what we're going to talk just a little bit more about right now. So when the soil's saturated with water, the structure weakens. And I like to think of soil as a sponge. When a sponge is really dry, it can withstand a lot of pressure, right? And the structure doesn't really change. But when a sponge is really wet and we can easily squeeze it in our hand, the structure gets weak when it's saturated. And soil is really similar. It has tiny pores where water and air collect. And soil compaction occurs when soil particles press together and collapse those tiny pore spaces. And instead of being able to kind of drain through, it will run off. And so you deal with a bit more of that. And the structure of the soil will change the ability for it to be able to bounce back or not, kind of like when you let go of that sponge. And you can kind of think about something like the hooves of a 1,000-pound animal in one concentrated spot, causing a lot of compaction when that's happening over time, especially when the soil is saturated. And soil, compacted soils have poor water filtration and drainage. So that can definitely be a big piece of that issue in some areas on your farm. And, why is mud such a big concern? And some of these might be obvious, but some of them not so much. But we definitely will deal with mud harboring pathogens and parasites and issues like that. It can damage hooves and prevent injuries from healing. It can damage plants. If you've got a lot of mud, right, we're really reducing production in our pastures. And soil erosion, if we've got a lot of bare soil and a lot of rain, we're going to see more soil being taken away with those water particles. In the summer in those areas, we're going to deal with dust. And then, of course, manure reaching surface waters. So we really want to prevent that as much as possible, being taken away with that mud, and protecting that as much as possible. So the first step is always going to be developing a winter confinement area. So a winter confinement area is an enclosed outdoor area where livestock are fed, watered, and excluded from grazing areas. There are several types of different ones, depending on maybe the way you use it or how often animals are in there, whether it's full time or it's maybe just for part of the time year round. Depends on how you are using it. And when we talk about it here specifically, we're talking about something that we can then concentrate the area that we're managing in the winter in particularly. And so there are several benefits to doing that. You're protecting your pastures from overgrazing, and really over time working on some of those specific things, you can see the yield of your pasture increase and preferred forages be what's what we want to be there, instead of having a lot more weed pressure or forages that our animals aren't going to eat. It can be a lot easier to manage manure and mud. And again, we're really going to protect any nearby surface groundwaters or habitat. And thinking about just like when are the big crucial times for when we want to confine livestock, whenever the soil is saturated, and that can be for several months during our rainy season here to really prevent that compaction. And then during the grazing season, whenever there isn't enough grass available. So when you talk about sort of some grazing heights and different principles there, we want to rest it, and that's part of how we can improve that pasture. And so tonight we're not going to really dig into pasture management. However, in the resources that I provide at the end, there'll be a lot more information on there, including some recorded workshops that I've done previously that dig just into that subject. So what can you do this winter? And let's talk about that for a minute. So thinking about right now, if you can remove your livestock from some of those main pasture areas, maybe you pick one area that is maybe lower performing or in a good convenient spot that you can sort of concentrate them in a little bit more, to give you an area that you can manage better for mud and manure. So we want to think about locating a temporary site for that, and that's where we can get started right now. And we can apply a temporary footing. In some cases, you might want to focus on the muddiest areas. And the most common temporary footing is hog fuel, or something that's sort of organic that we can do right now. And in order to have the best drainage for that, there's a little bit more in terms of how much and layers that we can think about. And we're going to cover some more permanent options, but I want to provide that first. So focusing footing near water and feeding areas. And then if it makes sense for what your management style and what you can do in those areas, picking up manure is really going to reduce mud. Manure turns into mud, so that can add to a lot of it. And then if possible, installing gutters and downspouts on shelters where the livestock are located could really help divert some of that water away, keeping it clean, preventing it from coming in contact with that manure, and trying to, usually we want to divert it into a grassy area. So we have something that's like fast growing vegetation that can kind of uptake that and slow down its movement. So for hog fuel, for something that you can do right now, this is definitely an option. And there's a few different pieces to this that are important to consider. And again, in the resources that I provide at the end, there'll be more detailed instructions on this, so you'll have more to refer back to. But to do this, we'll remove any existing bedding and manure from that spot if possible, getting down as much as you can. You might not get all of it and leave a few inches. And then the first thing that we apply is what's called an interface layer, or that's going to be what comes directly in contact with the soil. And having that different material underneath is going to extend the life of the material you put on top of it. And so that interface layer in this picture is straw, but in some cases it might be hay or wood chips or cardboard or newspaper. But we need that to be pretty thick. We want it to be about 3 to 6 inches. And then over top of that, we apply the hog fuel, and you need quite a bit. You need about 1.5 feet to 2 feet, and that'll compress down to 6 to 8 inches. So that's going to give you a pretty firm and dry surface, and that's any manure that actually is, you know, the livestock are producing in that area. It's going to tie up some of the nutrients like nitrogen in it too. So it's going to have several benefits while providing some good firm footing that's mud free, or as close as we can get to it, right? So this, I just put this picture in here before we start talking about some more permanent systems, and I really like it, and it's a great example of thinking maybe long-term how you can set things up. So in this picture, we've got what's closest to us is their confinement area, and it's got a permanent footing of gravel and geotextile, and there's some rubber mats there on some of the higher traffic areas. And then there's a laneway going out to these different pastures that could then be divided and animals could be rotated through. So when we're thinking ahead, you know, you've got yourself through this winter and early spring, and then you're kind of thinking about, well, how do I want to deal with future years? What can I think about that might work more for me if I want a different system? So with that, there's some different considerations, and you know, you want to think about location. There's some things to consider with that, what the size is going to be, any maintenance that might have to happen is going to be different for different materials, and management is going to be different for them as well. So it's got to work for you. And then thinking about different footing options, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. So when thinking about location, we always want to try to find an area that's more high, dry ground and convenient to access. And we want ideally to locate it near where we're going to store any manure that we pick up, so that it's something that is, you know, chore efficient for you. And when we design these systems, we want to have a slight grade to it to provide some really good drainage. And that grade is really small, like 1 to 3%. But at the same time, we want to stay away from any steep sloped areas so that we can really keep that footing in place and protect anything. You know, we don't want as much erosion happening, so we want to do that. And then we try to stay away from any surface waters like wetlands, ponded areas, anything frequently flooded, wellheads if possible, and that sort of thing. And then we also ideally would have it surrounding fast growing vegetation, and that can act both as a filter strip to uptake any nutrients that run off, but then you're also creating a border that's going to help keep that whole system in place, but catching and absorbing and potentially filtering, so it can help with any of that. So when we think about size, here's some different examples and guidelines. So a small enclosure, there's some different examples here, is typically maybe it's going to be different than an exercise area. It might be something that they go into at night, or it's more of a concentrated area that works well for a small group of animals, or something like that. And then there's also more of a larger enclosure or an exercise enclosure that would typically maybe be where livestock are not in full time, they have periodic access to, or you have a footing down for that whole area to try to reduce mud as much as possible. There's some different sizes there. And then there's what's called a track paddock. And a track paddock is a walking pathway set up outside of a grazing area, and it's a way to provide more exercise for your livestock while controlling their access to pasture. So it's often between 8 to 12 feet wide, and thinking about like long, narrow runs. And it works really well when you have just a, you know, I would say I've seen it work really well on 2+ acres. And you know, what you do is you have sort of the water and like feed dispersed in different areas, which encourages them to move around. And the width has to do with like wanting them to move around and not sort of stay in one place to kind of encourage that movement, but wide enough that it's right for the temperament or the number of animals. It's a really cool system that I've seen work really well here. But this is a great, the size is ultimately up to you. So there's some guidelines that this is actually from OSU Extension and thinking about some different things. So it can help just think about that minimum square foot per animal and how you might be able to set up that system for you. And of course, you know, there's no perfect way. And these are just some general guidelines to kind of think about what might work well. And the biggest objectives there is that you want to keep it manageable and you want to try to keep it clean. So it really needs to work for you. And management style is really important to consider no matter what you choose, right? It has to work for you. There's no perfect answer. And you're going to create more work for yourself, right? If we're picking up manure or managing these areas, but the trade-off is hopefully, you know, hopefully healthier animals, a more productive pasture, and really having some of this mud and manure under control. So as we go through the next part and talk about some different footings, here's some questions that you can ask yourself. Thinking about like how often can you pick up manure and what might work for you? Is it really frequently, like every day or a few times a week? Or is it something more like what you can handle is a lot less frequently than that, and thinking about what footings will need different maintenance? There'll be, you know, each one will have a different amount of time that it's going to take to maintain and upkeep. And then you can think about how you'd pick up the manure in those areas, whether it's, you know, by hand with a pitchfork or a stall fork, or whether, you know, in some cases it might work for your system to use a tractor, or in some cases, if you had something like the hog fuel and had sort of more of a deep bedded pack method, that's kind of stay there all winter long. It's more about what equipment you might use to actually have to take that out and put more in. So, and you know, is your main goal to improve that pasture and protect it? Or maybe you have a lot less land, and so that's not the biggest concern for you in terms of that piece. And then of course, yeah, what will work best for the type, you know, what livestock you have, then the number of animals and their temperament. So to just dig into these a little bit, we're going to kind of go through some pros and cons of why you would use different ones. So for hog fuel, we kind of just talked about what you can do right now in terms of putting those initial layers down. But if you wanted to use this footing for more thinking about like the long term and thinking that this system could work really well for you, we put something more firm underneath that hog fuel that can stay there. In some cases, it's like large crushed rock or quarry SPALLS. So this is explaining kind of how that system would look. So using the hog fuel, it is really a great choice for small livestock, just because it's going to be easier to manage, and it can be a great choice for if you have any inside areas, or, you know, potentially against the barn, something that is going to have some shelter associated with it to make it last a bit longer by having less contact with rain, right? And hog fuel is pretty affordable and usually easy to source, so that's great. And it definitely requires less daily management because you're having a material that can kind of soak up more of the, you know, urine and tie up nutrients. And so you're creating this system that is going to break down over time, but that it's got a lot less daily management. Oh boy. And then it looks like these got out of order. So thinking about some reasons why it might not be right for you, it does require regular replacement. So it's going to break down and turn into compost and organic matter. So it'll eventually turn into mud. So what we have to do is then scrape that out and apply a new layer, in this case on top of that crushed rock or quarry spalls. It does require a lot of footing, having, you know, 1.5 to 2 feet of hog fuel down and thinking about that piece. Sometimes the source materials can vary in the quality that you can get from, you know, your local landscaping company or anything like that. And then that last one is that in most cases, having a little bit of a slight slope really helps with drainage. So with the hog fuel and thinking about that, when we do these projects, and why we're kind of thinking about long-term is ideally we do these in the summer when we have really firm soil. We don't have as much of a soil erosion risk, and we can really work that area. So we start by scraping the surface. So we want to start from scratch, and we usually scrape down at least a few inches, and in that process we can create that 1 to 3% grade. And then in this example, that's when you would install the crushed rock or quarry spalls. So this is quarry spalls in this picture, a layer of like 3 to 6 inches. And then in this picture, they're using a plate compactor to compress it down to kind of create like a nice level surface. And the spalls, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, this is now your interface layer, and it's a much more strong, stable, durable layer that's going to prevent that hog fuel from mixing in with the soil and breaking down a lot quicker. And then that's when we put down that hog fuel in the high amount that we talked about. So I'm going to move on to another option, and we'll talk really briefly about this one. In some cases, especially when you have maybe a larger exercise area that the livestock don't have access to all the time, you can maintain a forage, like forage grasses or legume footing. And there are some advantages to that. It is a great choice for those larger areas. It really works well in well-draining soils, because you're going to have soils that are going to dry out quicker, might be more resilient against compaction issues. And that it is a pretty affordable option, and that seed is easy to source. But some disadvantages is that you got to really choose a forage species that's going to work with kind of having like heavy hoof action and establishes quickly, can handle more heavier grazing. So there are just certain specific ones that will work better. It does require resting periods, which is why I said they wouldn't be on it all the time. If they were on it all the time, then we're gonna create another mud issue for ourselves. And because there's a lot of hoof pressure and a lot of heavy grazing potentially at times, these do need to be replanted. If you might get more bare spots that need to be replanted, or depending on the forage that you plant, if it's an annual or something that's not going to have a long longevity, then it'll need to be replanted. In some cases, someone might worry about having more exposure to parasites because we have maybe there's more manure on that surface and that it's an organic surface there, and that no matter what, you're going to have some weeds to deal with, right? So that'll still be part of that process. And when we think about installing a forage planting as a footing, we're always going to need to make a plan for weed management so that what you plant can actually establish there and establish well. And we mow down the existing forage at the lowest setting. And typically we want to harrow those fields several times to really scratch up the surface and expose some soil that the seed can have direct contact with, and breaking up any clumps of manure on the surface and that kind of thing as well. And then we would broadcast or drill seed there. And typically we do this in the early fall in our climate before the frost date. That's really there, you know, you can do some plantings in the spring, but the best time to reseed areas is going to be in the fall around here to have that consistent rainfall as it's establishing as well. So, and then with these type systems, especially right after you plant, you're going to need to keep livestock off of it until late spring at the earliest, so you can really get something established with a good root structure. So there are some good, you know, reasons for doing something like this in a larger area, absolutely, and it's pretty affordable and could be a good system for you. So sand is another option, and there are definitely some pros to that. It can be a really great choice for most horses, and in some cases cows. I've seen that work really well for small herds of cattle. It does provide more comfort for joints and hooves, so some people really like that aspect of it. It does work best in well-draining soils. Not to say that it won't work in other situations, but it's a little bit more planning to make sure that you do have good draining there. And it is relatively easy to pick manure out of the sand, and pretty easy to source. We have so many quarries around here. But some of the cons, it often requires additional applications depending on if you've got something sort of protecting it around the edges, or, you know, you're going to be taking care of it a bit. It does require a lot of frequent removal of manure, and then from animals kind of walking around in it, and, you know, those kind of things. There actually often is a lot of raking that needs to be done as well, just to smooth out that surface. It doesn't drain as well as gravel, so it's just a little more slow draining than that. And if any of you do feed off the ground, it's really recommended to not do that, to have something lifted up so you don't have to worry about the risk of colic. And it can be expensive. So I'd say the biggest con there in thinking about your management style is going to be that frequent removal of manure and potentially like raking and leveling out the surface. But for sand, we can do a footing of quarry spalls again. So it's, you know, we've got that surface, starting from scratch there. And again, the spalls, and then that layer of sand on top of about 6 to 8 inches of sand that's going to compress down a little bit. So there's kind of a thinking about that piece, and we're going to talk a little bit too about using geogrids with sand in a minute. So another option is gravel, and it's a really common good footing that you see around here. So the pros with that, it's a great choice for a lot of different livestock, horses, sheep, goats, and it does provide a really nice firm footing. It's really long lasting. Once you have it, you know, set up and established, you don't have as much maintenance for several years. It drains well on most soil types, so that's really great. And manure, it, you know, instead of maybe as frequently as sand, you've got a little bit more of a leeway, but it is still manure that you're going to be picking up pretty regularly in this system. So some of the cons there is we don't usually use gravel or recommend it for cattle because their manure is not as easy to pick up in that situation. And in some cases, another con that I've heard is that for older horses, it might be too firm of a surface. The initial cost can be a bit expensive, but again, once you have this really nice setup system, maintenance is less than something like the hog fuel, right? So with that, you know, we're always starting with that scraped soil surface, and in this case, this is a picture of putting down that geotextile fabric that acts as a barrier and limits the interaction with the gravel and the soil. And some tips there, we always overlap sections and leave at least 2 feet around the edges. We're trying to extend that fabric and sort of bury the edges so that we don't have to, in some cases, deal with it coming up over the years. So there's just a few things there with the geotextile that we try to make sure. And then in this case, we're working with a base layer and a top layer. So that base layer is usually a larger crushed rock. It could be the quarry SPALLS, or it could be more like a ballast rock that's like 1 or 2 inches. And that's applied and compressed. And then we put on the top layer. And one size rock that I really like for the top is the 5/8- crushed angular rock. And in the past, what I've used is the unwashed with fines, and that's applied and compressed to form that nice solid surface, and the rock kind of knits together. So you're creating a good surface that's pretty easy to pick up manure and don't get as much of that in the manure itself. And it will compact over time, so we add enough to manage for that compaction a little bit. So here's just an example of what the before and after with the gravel can look like. And I'm gonna briefly just talk about the GeoGrid footing as another option. And it's definitely something that's becoming popular because it does really stabilize and in some cases reduce how much footing you need to apply. So yes, stays in place, less gravel or sand needed. So it's definitely something that people use with the sand footing, in which case, you know, you have a more level surface. You don't have to use as much because you've got something that's really stabilizing and holding in place. When you use the GeoGrid, you don't necessarily need the geotextile. The grid is enough there. And there are some different materials. In this picture is more of a soft one that you kind of need to stake down before you put it in. And then there's some that kind of clip in. So there's some different options there. Pretty easy to install. But in some cases, some of the cons primarily is that it can be more expensive, right? Upfront costs or for repair, but it does have a lot of benefits for using it. And here's just kind of a picture. The top one there is interlocking those grids in place. And typically we do have some of the smaller crushed rock below it before we put those grids on. So it's really great, and you're seeing a lot more of it these days. And then also thinking creatively, you can do some different combinations. So, you know, in this picture on the left, they're using a larger rock along the fence line and sort of maybe in those more areas where livestock are walking through and concentrating, and then have hog fuel around it. In the picture on the right, you've got the concrete right around. Some people even use like rubber mats for that as well, but just creating a really firm surface that you can easily clean, and then gravel outside of that. And you do see the combination footing with thinking about maybe you could just put it in concentrated areas in where the feeding is or where there's heavy traffic and walkways. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit more about manure now and why we would manage manure. So, you know, with high exposure to manure, we might have more issues with parasites in our livestock. Manure is going to give breeding habitat for insects, so we might have more of that to deal with. In some cases, there can be hoof infections. There's a bacteria in manure that can actually slowly over time dissolve the hooves. So, you know, there are some potentials there. But if we manage the manure and we use it and apply it back and at the right rates at the right time for our pastures, we can actually save money and use it as a primary fertilizer. And by collecting it and breaking it down in that way, we can reduce odors. And we're really trying to minimize any risk of manure reaching surface and groundwater. So if we can really help prevent that. And when we think about manure, it adds up really quickly, right? So this is just a chart of how much an average estimated pounds per day. And so thinking about a horse, we usually say it's about 50 pounds a day. And that means that that's about 1.5 5-gallon buckets a day. And in just a year, that's enough to fill an entire truck bed. And that's just per horse. So it adds up quickly, and thinking about what's going to be a good system for management is really important. And that doesn't include bedding. So bedding can double the amount, and it can make the pile of manure compost a lot slower because it's higher in carbon. It breaks down slower. And, you're going to potentially need more manure storage. So in terms of what you can do right now, looks like collecting in confinement areas. Let's see, I got a little mixed up, so we'll just do that. Collecting in confinement areas, reducing stall bedding materials can decrease the volume of your manure pile if that's something that's works for you in your system, if you have inside areas. And in that same situation, you could switch to a more efficient bedding material that can take up more liquids with less applied, like a pelletized wood that expands when wet. So there's maybe some different options there. But in general, we want to work on one pile at a time and store it in one location. And then we want to tarp that to protect any of it from washing away. And also we're controlling the process of it breaking down and trying to break it down more efficiently. And another option is removing it off site. If you don't have a lot of acreage to spread it on, then that might be a really good option for you. And right now, we're thinking in the future, designing a bin and figuring out what's right for you there is going to be really helpful. Okay. So if removal offsite is something that is interesting to you, there's a few different options for doing that. Pierce Conservation District does have a manure exchange program. And in the resources that I'm sharing at the end, there's actually a great little video to tell you more about it. But that can be an option if you don't have a huge amount of manure that you're trying to get rid of. We connect folks that have manure with people that want it for fertilizer, like for gardening or landscaping. There are some different composting businesses around here that you can, that will take the manure for a fee, or there are hauling services. So there's a few different options for thinking about that. And one thing to consider is maybe how many animals can, like their manure that they produce is needed for your fields. So this 1 cow, 1 horse, 3 sheep or 3 goats, thinking about it somewhere in that relative range per acre is what the manure that's created from that. It's definitely something that the land can utilize. And then we can always work with you to help you figure out how much manure is right for applying and things like that. Especially as if you increase pasture production, there's a potential of needing to utilize them a lot more. So that's an advantage there. Okay, so when we think about considerations for how setting up a manure bin and building one, what that would look like, location is really important. And again, management style and thinking about what is going to work for you in terms of whether you want more of a one passive pile, or in some cases you might want multiple piles if you're interested in composting. And the size is really important so that it's the right size for the amount of manure that your livestock are producing. And in the tools that I'm sharing at the end, I have a manure volume calculator so that you can put in how many animals you have and what kind, and it can help you figure out what size dimensions of a bin that you'll need. So that's really great. Okay. So we'll talk about location. For where you'd want to put it, you want to locate it on high, dry level and well-drained ground. You want to avoid anywhere that there might be ponding or any surface waters. We try to keep it pretty far away from, in particular, wellheads, and you know, if you can, keep it a good distance away from ponded areas, wetlands, streams, any sort of surface water or wellheads for groundwater reasons, so that you can prevent contaminating any of that, and kind of really protect those resources if this is going to be a place where manure is stored long term. But it needs to be convenient for you. If you're going to start picking up manure or have different footings down, you want to make sure that it's in a spot that is easy for you to, you know, take that right to, and convenient. And we usually just recommend avoid locating it at the edge of your property. There are some different restrictions there in terms of what the county wants you to do, but also it's just a good way to be a good neighbor and planning forward that way. So with storage capacity, we want to plan for 6 months of storage. And we want to plan for the number of bins, like I just mentioned, thinking about those different options, and that for proper composting and making sure that, you know, you've got enough sort of surface area for it to get hot and start breaking down and reducing in size. We usually recommend a minimum width and height. So thinking about at least like 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, thinking about it like that. And also when we're thinking about these bins and how we're going to manage them, typically we want them to be wide enough for the width of our tractor bucket. So that's really easy to get in and out. And every single type of thing that you can build and using different materials is going to have a different expense. So that's something to consider. There are a lot of different ways that you could build it. And in kind of the pictures as we go through this next part, I'm giving you some different examples, like this one here with the sort of concrete walls and concrete base that are both poured, and then the wood for the roof there, and an even simpler system on this slide. So with designing it, you know, it can really be site specific and what's going to work for you. The base is often concrete and with bumpers around it to collect any liquid from your pile. That liquid is really high in nutrients, so we're trying to keep that with the pile as well. Otherwise, the base can be just like an earthen floor as long as it's located far enough away from your wellhead and some of those surface areas in particular, and you keep it covered. And thinking about the walls, again, lots of different materials to use, and you'll see some more examples as we go along there, but concrete, ecology blocks, wood boards, whatever you have on hand might work too. You can be resourceful. And then in some cases, ramps can be really great for thinking about how you're going to easily, maybe if you're using that wheelbarrow, how you're going to easily put that in there, or your tractor bucket. You might not need that for it. And then coverings, you know, the easiest thing that you can do is like that first picture there, covering it with a tarp, or building kind of a simple roof that can be removed, or you can go as far as kind of building that structure around it. Either way, thinking about, you know, if you do have a roof, that we're going to want to divert some of that water away. And usually we put some gutters and downspouts and if possible, like an outlet that's diverting that clean water away to prevent it from coming in contact with that manure. And so composting is a really great way to reduce the volume, and it can reduce to about 50% less. So we're really breaking that down as we break down the structure and loss of moisture. And then through that process, if it gets hot enough, we're killing parasites and pathogens, which is really great. And you know, if it's a hot compost pile, we're going to be reducing weed seeds so that those aren't getting respread in your fields. When you compost and you're breaking it down, you're going to have a lot of reduced odors ultimately from, you know, breaking down into really nice compost. And you're creating a stable fertilizer, so the nutrients are in a more stable form. And there's nutrients are released slower over time. There's some of there's not as much certain things like nitrogen that there is in raw manure, but you're creating this really stable fertilizer that's going to provide a lot of good nutrients, including buffering your pH. So there's some good things there. And composting is going to shorten the time that the soil, that the manure turns into compost quite significantly. But it is higher intensity management to think about having those piles and doing all of that, and you will need more storage space by having kind of completing one pile at a time and starting that process, and then potentially, you know, having the right equipment for it and setting it up. So oftentimes you'll see different aeration systems that can actually improve the compost and get it really, really hot, and thinking about ways that we can actually reduce that composting time. But through this process, we're breaking down that manure into organic matter. So it's fueled by oxygen and the aerobic bacteria that as we turn the pile and we have sort of these aeration systems through it as well, we're introducing more oxygen, and that's going to speed up microbial activity. And the nitrogen and carbon ratio can vary depending on what type of livestock you have, or what type of bedding that you use. So that ratio is going to affect the breakdown speed. So that's a good thing to consider. And when we think about composting our piles in our region, we sort of give a minimum of 3 to 4 months. Because we don't get as hot of weather here, that can really impact and slow down the composting process depending on what time of year it is. And that we do usually use tarps or roofs to kind of control that moisture, so that, you know, in the summertime, in some cases, we might need more moisture, but in the winter, we're going to have too much. So we really want to tarp that and kind of control that. We want that moisture level to be when that's going to make the microbes really active. So too much or too little will slow them down a lot. And there are some additional resources that are going to be in the folder that I provide at the end. And also we've got some great videos that we've made, and we do offer composting workshops. So look for that in the future, that can really dig into this process and subtleties. But manure is a really great resource, and when livestock are grazing, they remove nutrients from the land, and so returning that manure is going to promote fertility and improve plant growth. And we've got the nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus that are really important nutrients for our forage grasses. So to protect water quality, we really want to carefully plan when and where we apply our manure. Proper manure management ensures that nutrients are applied at the right rate and distribution during the times of the year when plants are well established and actively growing and can utilize that nutrients right away. So we apply in late spring and early fall when grass is really actively growing and we have the right field and weather conditions. So the right weather conditions, we're looking for at least a 3-day window where there's no forecasted rainfall or flood events. So we're trying to think about having a bit of a time in those seasons where we have a bit more of like controlled moisture and no heavy forecasted big events happening. And the calendar that's on the screen here shares more about some of those pieces. It's a general guidance, and it's actually from a resource that I made that'll be available to you at the end that kind of shows you what different months we want to spread. And it's also showing you setbacks. So it's showing you that setbacks refer to the distance between where you're spreading and where there's any surface water. So we are recommending these set distances to kind of protect that. And kind of we've been talking a little bit about water quality tonight and the distance we want to keep from some of those surface waters. So that's what we're talking about here. And the calendar there has some recommended setbacks depending on the time of the year. So also we have some additional resources, of course, for figuring out what's going to work best for you and how to create these good systems. So of course, we're available to do farm visits and technical assistance so that we can provide more like one-on-one and site-specific recommendations to reach your management goals. So that's always an option now or in the future. And that we do have equipment rentals at the district. So we have 2 different sizes of manure spreaders for rent, in addition to some other equipment like spreaders and no-till seed drill and flail mower and hay probe, things like that, that can help you manage your land. And we do offer soil and manure testing. So if one of your goals is to improve your pasture, for instance, that can be a really great place to start. And we can determine from those results what nutrients your pastures are deficient in and what fertilizers and how much you need to correct that and help you come up with a plan. And I've mentioned it a couple of times, but we have a resource folder full of more information and great handouts for you, and I'm putting that in the chat right now, so that's available for you. And there's also some recorded webinars, and a few of these are actually ones that I did in 2020, and then another one from another team member at Pierce Conservation District. But there's some great recorded workshops if you really want to dig into pasture management and figuring out those pieces more. And also we've got some great farm planning videos as well on our YouTube page. So that'll be all linked in that Google Drive folder. There's a composting livestock manure video on there as well. And I just wanted to share that we do have some more workshops coming up. We've got a great one that's going to be talking about forage and fodder. Another one that's getting started with your farm. So it's really going to dig into some different things like permitting and regulations and critical areas and those types of things that when you're thinking about construction and those pieces can be really helpful. And another workshop coming up on fertilizing crops and pastures. So if you're on our newsletter, it's a great way to stay connected for everything that we're offering at the district. So right now I'd love to answer some questions, and I know several of you have written some things in there, and it actually looks like Renee has given some great answers too. So that's super helpful. Thanks for bearing with us and for listening through all of that. Looks like you guys were talking about hog fuel a bit. But this is a great time. If anyone has any questions, you can type them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and answer, and I'll be happy to chat with you. And then I did want to put this up so you can reach out to me or Renee, but we also have some other great farm planners that work in different areas in Pierce County that can help you. So we're all here to work with you, and that's our really main goal, is to help you address those goals and concerns on your property. So Tanya said, is toxicity something to be concerned about with hog fuel? With that, it's just really important to make sure that the source of materials isn't something that's toxic, and that's usually something that who you're getting it from can answer. So, there's certain trees that can be toxic to certain livestock. So that's the one thing there that's really important. And with wood chips too, if you were going to use wood chips or something. Yeah, so Ross, the Pierce Conservation District, we do cover Pierce County, but if you're located somewhere else, we definitely encourage you to reach out to your local conservation district, or if you don't know where that is, I'd be happy to, if you want to send me a message or an email, we can help you find the right ones. There's a district in every part that you're located in Washington state for sure. And if you're out of state, there's definitely districts we could connect you with. Yeah, and I thanks for your comment, Pamela. I think that that's such a huge piece of this, is that there is a lot of potential planning involved. And so hopefully tonight I gave you a lot of things to think about, and a place for starters, and really that there is no one size fits all. I like Renee said to me the other day, is that you pick your poison, because it's no matter what, thinking about land management, you are gonna create some more work for yourself, but hopefully, it's all worth it. And there's a lot of good, rewarding things that come out of it. But we're happy to help with things like figuring out what design might work, or any of those pieces, like where you want to locate it, or all of the, what footings and what fencing and those kind of things. So we are, here for some of that site specific and farm visits and planning. And right now we're still doing site visits. They're no contact and outdoors, if that's, we can talk more about that too, but we're definitely here for that. And I appreciate all you guys joining us tonight. Let's see. And so I did put the Google Drive folder in the chat, but I will email all of you with that link to follow up, so that you have that there. Ross said, I don't think Kitsap has any equipment rentals. I actually am not sure about that, but we can talk, Ross, and we can see what, if they don't have something, maybe another nearby district is another possibility. Or I mean, we have equipment rentals, so that might work for you, but we can chat about that. Well, I'm here if anyone has any other questions and wants to chat, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining me tonight. And hopefully I look forward to meeting some of you. What can you tell us about funds available for fencing? So Pierce Conservation District, we do have some temporary electric fencing that we loan out to folks for free. So it's an opportunity to try something. And then, you know, in terms of, there might be options in some cases if we have cost share available and it's the right fit, we will fund cross fencing. So that's always something to explore. But yeah, you know, we do help folks think about what could be the right system for dividing up and setting up pastures, and what might make sense for fencing in that case. So hopefully I answered your question to the best ability that I can, but we can always follow up about that if you want to talk more about it and your site. And yeah. All right, I'm going to close out, but thank you all so much. And I appreciate you hanging out and chatting tonight. That's great. I don't know what your first name is, LJ Hadley, but let's absolutely chat and connect. If you want a site visit, we can arrange for that and have one of our farm team that's works in your area. Hi, Lori. So we can connect about that. That's great. Okay, well, I hope everybody has a really good night and it was good chatting with you. Take care for now.